Welcome to the For Peyton podcast. I'm Tami Valentine, and this podcast is about mental health, real life, and the experiences that shape us. I created this podcast in memory of my son Peyton, known to many as Pete, who passed away in December of 2024. Whether you're here for insight, connection, or simply a deeper conversation, I'm just glad you're here. This is For Peyton. Welcome to this clinical deep dive episode. This is a follow-up episode from my conversation with Western sports announcer Brandon Edwards. Before I dive into all of the things that came up in that conversation, I want you to stop and think about something. If I were to ask you a question of what is physical health, I'm probably going to get responses like, well, it's, eating healthy, it's staying active, it's getting enough sleep, it's physical wellness checks, it's all of those things. But a lot of times if I ask someone about mental health, I don't get a picture of health. I actually get a picture of mental health problems. Get responses like anxiety, depression, suicidality. And the conversation, instead of talking about what does mental health look like, we talk about all the mental health problems that so many of us struggle with. What's interesting is in my conversation with Brandon, which I thought was going to be a lot of talk about rodeo and coaching, when I dug a little deeper and listened to the conversation on a different level, a lot of what we talked about was about what mental health actually looks like. What does it look like to be a mentally healthy person? And so in this clinical deep dive, we're going to get into some of that. We're going to look at a little bit of what does it look like when someone is mentally healthy? What are their habits? What are the way that they think? How do they challenge their thinking? How do they respond to criticism? How do they respond to praise? How do they work through challenges? So that's going to be the focus of what I talk about today. And hopefully at the end of the conversation, you're going to get some really good takeaways of how you can improve your overall mental health. As I dive into this, I have to give credit to one of my favorite therapists, researchers. Her name is Nancy McWilliams. And as I have studied her work, I have come to appreciate that she has provided us a lot of evidence and research on what a mentally healthy person looks like. And so I'm going to be referencing her work, and whether I give her credit throughout the entire episode or here and there, just know that that's the foundation of it. When I started the conversation with Brandon, one thing that he talked about was how his athletes respond to making a mistake. And one observation that he had made was that athletes often, when they make a mistake, they immediately jump to harsh self-criticism. He quoted them as often saying, "Look, you can't tear me down any better than I can tear myself down." And it made me think about this outside of just athletes, because I think a lot of us respond to mistakes with attack, not coaching. Most of us do not need a harsher inner critic. We actually need a better inner coach. So let's just take, for example, I'm new to podcasting. I'm just barely starting this, and recording these solo episodes has actually been a funny little laboratory for this. In real life, I'm pretty lively and I'm animated and I can talk through ideas all day. But then I sit down by myself with a microphone and suddenly I'm this very serious person. And it's like I'm reading a research paper into the void. And then when I listen back, my inner critic immediately calls a full staff meeting and starts analyzing everything that I did wrong. And I want to criticize it. I want to do a pre-episode that criticizes everything that I did wrong in the episode just so everybody knows that I'm aware of it. But that's not really helpful. And this is exactly what Brandon was talking about in our conversation. Some of us criticize ourselves first because it feels safer than waiting for someone else to do it. So let's talk a little bit about the science behind this. Self-criticism can actually feel protective. If I criticize myself first, maybe no one else can hurt me. And sometimes we tend to believe that shame actually creates a better learning environment. We're afraid that we can't give ourselves grace because then we're letting ourselves off the hook. But the truth is, shame does not create better learning. When we think about our nervous system, when we feel threatened, we will shut down everything and go into survival mode. And the thing we have to remember is survival mode is okay. It's necessary to get us through really tough times. But survival mode is not focused on growth. Survival mode is focused on protection. and survival. And so it's really hard for a nervous system that is in survival mode to flourish. It will survive, but it won't flourish, and it for sure won't grow. Shame will ask the question, how do I survive this? But let's talk about what coaching asks. Coaching will ask, what can I learn from this? So let's break this down a little bit more and talk about shame as a critic versus coaching as an encourager. A critic will say, you're terrible. A coach says, let's figure out what happened. A critic will criticize your identity. A coach will address behavior. Critics create shame. Coaches create possibility. Something that's really important here is, are you operating listening to the voice of an inner critic, or are you operating listening to the voice of an inner coach? And one thing that Nancy McWilliams talks about is the ability to develop self-observation. And I love that because there's a big difference between self-observation and self-condemnation. The healthier question is not always what's wrong with me. Sometimes the healthier question is, what happened here? What can I learn? And how can I grow? And what needs to change? When we think through this, it's really important to remember that correction without compassion usually produces shame, and correction with compassion creates the conditions for growth. This is something that Brandon shared when he talked about his coaching style versus his wife's coaching style. He talked about how his wife is an encourager, how he said after someone meets with her and has a session with her, they feel like they can go out and run through a brick wall. And he loves that, and he celebrated that. He said, but I also feel like there has to be a place where we can provide correction. And he pointed out that encouragement and correction have to come with a balance of timing. I think that those are important things to take away. It's about learning how to carry both. He and I even talked about like the Ted Lasso approach, how Ted Lasso's team consists of people who are encouragers and correctors. And when you put it all together, that's what makes a good coach. Some things to maybe think about as we go through this is, where do I attack myself instead of coaching myself? What would I want to say to someone I loved that's in the same situation? And can I correct my behavior without condemning the person? Can I be honest without being cruel? And so I think those are important ways to start to shift the self-talk that we engage in from critic to coach. It's okay that there's correction, but it's also okay that there's encouragement. And for most of us, it often feels like the only way we know how to grow is by shaming ourselves. And eventually growth starts to feel dangerous. A good coach tells the truth, but it tells it in a way that leaves room for growth and for hope. So another thing that I took away from my conversation with Brandon, and it was something that I feel like really hit home for me, is that he pointed out that some athletes don't know how to celebrate the win. They're already worried about whether they can do it again. They win, but instead of enjoying it, they're already thinking about the next one. We just keep moving the finish line. We keep raising the bar. We finish one race and we say, okay, well, now I got to run another one further and faster. And the scary thing about this is achievement becomes anxiety. And that often happens when we hand over our identity to our performance. Let me just say that one more time just to drive that point home. Achievement can become anxiety when we hand our identity over to our performance. So let me just tell you a little bit about like how this shows up for me. And since this is only my second solo episode, I'm going to just focus on what it's been like to launch a podcast. So even launching this podcast has shown me how quickly achievement can turn into analysis. I launched the first few episodes and I saw that there were actually some people listening. But instead of letting myself feel grateful or proud or even pleasantly surprised, my brain immediately wanted to know, is this good? Is it good enough? Does it count? Will the next episode do as well? I was taking my analytics and my statistics and I was dumping them into ChatGPT and saying, hey, how's this holding up? Where do I stand? Immediately, I couldn't even celebrate the like, hey, people listen to my podcast. Instead, I immediately raised the bar. If 10 people listened, then I need 20. If I got one review, I need 10 reviews. Again, my achievement immediately turned to anxiety. And that anxiety came as a result of overanalysis. And so instead of celebrating, I began to interrogate. Some other places in life where this shows up is Brandon talked about it with his rodeo athletes, but it also just shows up across the board for all of us as humans. You know, we earn a degree and then we think, now what? We lose weight and we immediately think, what if I gain it back? We get a promotion and now we think, well, now I have to prove that I deserve this promotion. We launch a new business and we think, oh, what if I can't sustain it? We, in my case, publish an episode and think, what if the next one flops? We finish one project and we say, where do I start the next one? And how do I make it better? So I think some of the things that we want to take away from this is performance is something that we do. Identity is who we are. Those are not the same thing. And when our identity starts to become dependent on our performance, then success becomes pressure and failure becomes a crisis and criticism feels like danger. And something that really stood out to me is that praise becomes something that we need more and more of. And so then it creates a lot of instability. And a stable self can enjoy success without being owned by it. Unstable self cannot enjoy success without it becoming part of their identity. So a couple of takeaways from that is remember that success is something to receive, not something to immediately defend. Some of us do not need to be more ambitious. We need to learn how to let good things land. That one really hit home for me. This idea that I don't need to be more ambitious, I need to learn how to let good things land. Another one is if you cannot rest after a success, then success has become another form of pressure. Pay attention to that. So if you experience something successful and your nervous system isn't letting you rest, then it has definitely become another form of pressure. Another important point is that learning to win with humility may be just as psychologically demanding as learning to lose with dignity. So, how do we apply this to becoming a more mentally healthy person? Here's a few practical questions. What success have I not let myself enjoy? Where did I move the finish line too quickly? Do I even have the ability to say this mattered? Can I say this mattered? I worked hard and I'm grateful without immediately adding a disclaimer to it? Can I let something be good without making it prove my worth? Resilience is not just about getting back up after failure. And sometimes I think that maybe we've defined resilience as that. We've kind of watered resilience down to nothing more than getting back up after a failure and enduring to the end. But resilience is actually much more than that. It's letting yourself stand in a good moment without needing to earn your right to be there. So let's dive into the next section. One thing that Brandon and I talked about, and it was a great conversation because he talked about it from his perspective as a college rodeo coach, and I talked about it from my perspective as a formal guidance counselor in a K-12 school district. He was sharing that his experience with his rodeo athletes is that when it comes time to apply for scholarships, there's all this money available. I saw the same thing when I was working with high school students. You see all this money that's available for scholarships. And we both talked about how sometimes it was hard to figure out why won't the students just apply? Like literally in an hour, they could apply for 4 or 5 scholarships worth thousands of dollars. And these are kids who know how to work. They have grit, they have perseverance, but why didn't they want to apply for the scholarships? And Brandon made the observation it wasn't that they were lazy and that they just didn't want to apply. He made the point that it wasn't about ambition, it was about fear, the fear of rejection. And underneath, they were avoiding the possibility of being turned down. They weren't just afraid of the application, they were afraid of what the rejection might mean. And so when we expand this outside of high school students and college rodeo athletes, this is true for all of us, right? Are we afraid of rejection to the point that it stops us from doing things that could be really meaningful in our lives? For example, there have been several times in my life when I almost talked myself out of something before anyone else ever had the chance to tell me no, like not going back to school or starting a business or launching a podcast. The one thing I had to slow down and pay attention to is which voice is louder, the fear of rejection or the fear of regret. The fear of rejection sometimes will just stop us dead in our tracks and we'll never try the thing. But sometimes we have to say, okay, thanks for that insight, voice that is the fear of rejection. But what about the voice that is fear of regret? How loud is that in our lives? Because I don't want to get to a point where I look back in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and all of a sudden that regret is saying, you know what? You should have just started the podcast. You should have just started the business. You should have just tried it. But you let the fear of rejection be the louder voice than the fear of regret. And sometimes we can create a really good story around it, right? The story that we tell ourselves can often sound very responsible. We might ask ourselves questions or we might reason in our mind with thoughts like, maybe this is not the right time. Maybe I'm too busy. Maybe I should wait until more. And actually, those are very reasonable things to ask, right? It's okay to assess the timing of a decision. It's okay to assess your capacity. It's okay to assess the knowledge and the experience that you have before you do something. But also, we need to dig a little deeper and say, am I asking these questions because it's reasonable to ask them? Or is this coming from that voice that fears rejection? Because sometimes underneath all the reasonable language is just fear with good grammar. So remember that. I think another important point that I want to make in response to the conversation that I had with Brandon is that our experiences matter, but the meaning that we attach to those experiences matter even more, because that is how we define our story. And the story that we tell ourselves makes the difference in what path we end up on. So, let's take, for example, you can have two people that experience the same thing, and one person will respond with an inner critic. And they'll say things like, that was awful. I'm a terrible person. I should never do that again. I can't believe that. I was rejected. I'm rejectable. I can't do this. Another person might respond to the same situation with, like, wow, that was hard. I didn't like it. But instead of saying, I should not try, they say, that didn't work. And instead of saying, I'm a terrible person, they say, you know what? I'm an uncomfortable person right now, but I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think through it, and I'm going to make the changes that I need to make to move forward. We can see the difference where one was responding from a nervous system that was shutting down and in survival mode, and one was responding from a nervous system that was responding to growth and the ability to flourish. In other words, one person had an inner self critic while another one had an inner self coach. There's a big difference. And the story can become the thing that either keeps wounding us or keeps encouraging us. And it's really important for us to recognize what are the automatic stories that I keep telling myself about experiences, because that can make or break the direction that we go from here. So, a couple of really important things to remember from this part of our conversation is failure is already painful enough. We don't have to turn it into an identity. And something that I tell my clients all the time is don't believe everything that you think. Not every thought is a fact. So silence that inner critic, listen to that inner coach, and say, where do we go from here? Another thing that's really important is not every fear is a prophecy. Sometimes that fear is fear of rejection, but it's definitely not always the voice of reason. And sometimes the fear of regret is so quiet that the fear of rejection is the only one driving the bus. Also, not every feeling is an accurate reflection of reality. Sometimes the story that is trying to keep us safe is also keeping us small. So, a couple of questions to think about from this part of our conversation. What have I already rejected myself from? What opportunity have I avoided so no one else can tell me no? What story did I attach to a past failure? And can I go back and coach myself through that story differently? Am I protecting myself from failure, or am I protecting an old identity story? Mental health, psychological maturity, it gives us room to pause before believing the first story that our mind creates. Sometimes our brains are trying to protect us, but that protection is not always the same as freedom. A story can be understandable and still be incomplete. And I think that that's the important thing we have to remember. Sometimes we want the whole story all at once, but just remember it can be understandable and still be incomplete, because growth doesn't always mean changing what happened. It usually means changing the meaning we carry forward from it. Again, growth does not always mean changing what happened. Growth means changing the meaning we carry forward from it. As our conversation continued, one really important point that Brandon made is that when life gets hard, he starts listing what he's grateful for. And I love that. He said, I'm trying to focus on what I'm grateful for. And sometimes I think we feel like gratitude is denial or toxic positivity. But actually, gratitude is perspective. Gratitude does not erase the hard thing, but it actually reminds us that the hard thing is not the only thing. A lot of times when we're overwhelmed, our brain narrows the the focus, and it locks into like threat and criticism and uncertainty and disappointment. That narrowing isn't weakness, it's survival. But like we've said before, flourishing requires the wider vision. And this is where gratitude comes into play. Gratitude widens the frame. It reminds our nervous system to step out of survival mode so that there can be room for growth. Gratitude doesn't say this does not hurt, but it does say this hurts, but there's still more. This is something that I definitely experienced through the loss of my son. It was incredibly hard and sad and heartbreaking to lose my son. At the same time, there was so much to be grateful for. We had a community that showed up for our family in ways that I can't even begin to explain. And what happened in a moment when my nervous system wanted to shut everything down and go into survival mode, people showed up in my life and reminded me that there's always something to be grateful for. It might be a plate of cinnamon rolls. It might be a piece of meaningful jewelry. It might be a knock at the door saying, "You guys doing okay?" It might be a text saying, "We're thinking about you." But those acts of service and kindness enabled me to widen my lens and be grateful. And when that happened, that protected my nervous system from shutting down and going into survival mode. What it did was it gave me something to be grateful for in my darkest times. And that gratitude protected my nervous system from going into survival mode. And it widened that lens of perspective so that I could continue to flourish through one of the most difficult challenges I've ever faced. I think another thing that I would bring to the table with this, something that can help with gratitude, is I would encourage everybody just to be grateful for the ordinary moments. You know, we have a lot of ordinary days that we take for granted. I think about the day that Peyton passed. That morning, he and I sat in my kitchen and we talked about what the day held for both of us. He told me what he was excited about, what he was dreading, you know, the day-to-day conversations that we have. And we sat and we chatted, and I told him what my day was and said, "All right, well, I'll see you this evening." And I told him stop by for dinner, and I told him that I loved him, and then I headed out the door to work. When I look back, I am so grateful that God gave us that one little moment, because it was that afternoon that he was in an accident and I didn't get to talk to him again. And so be grateful for the ordinary moments. Look around and see the things that are in front of you, those things that we take for granted. We never know. I had no idea that would be my last conversation. And I'm learning to appreciate when one of my kids stopped by the house. I always want to just sit down and listen to him. When I have an ordinary Saturday morning or an ordinary Sunday afternoon, I just want to be grateful for it and not take it for granted like I would have done before. So the point I really want to drive home here is that gratitude does not erase grief. It doesn't make depression and anxiety automatically go away. But what it does do is it helps us regulate our nervous system so that we don't go into complete survival mode and can't continue to grow through adversity. The other thing I think that goes along with this was Brandon talked about one of my favorite things of the year, and that is one of our small community big celebrations, and that's Manassas Pioneer Days. And it's an interesting dynamic. This is a little sleepy town in rural Colorado, and yet for one weekend out of the year, it becomes this metropolis of celebration. There's carnival, there's rodeos, there's derbies, there's entertainment, there's parades, there's families getting back together. It's such a fun weekend for our community, and people come home for this. And I have been able to be the president of the board that's been over this celebration for the last 9 years. Last year, I handed off the torch and stepped down from my position on that board and handed it off to a great committee. It's in good hands, but it's been very important in my life for all of my life growing up, and especially as an adult. But Brandon is our rodeo announcer and our demolition derby announcer. So he's one of the outsiders that comes in and has that perspective of what this looks like from the outside looking in. And in our conversation, he pointed out that it's been very meaningful for him to watch an entire town pause. And families get together, neighbors reconnect, kids laugh. People remember that they belong to something, that life isn't just a production. Life is about belonging. And I think that that's such an important point. This is something that research shows us over and over again, that it's such a crucial part of mental health is a sense of belonging, because psychological maturity and emotional well-being doesn't just happen inside of us, it happens between us. We're not just healed by insight. we're steadied by belonging. And while gratitude helps us see reality more completely, belonging helps us experience it internally. And so psychological maturity and mental health is learning not to miss your life while you're busy trying to improve it. So a couple of questions to take away from this is, what is still good in life for me right now? Who's showing up for me? What ordinary moments deserve more attention? Where in my life am I moving so fast that I'm not noticing the things that are more important? Where have I confused gratitude with pretending? And can I let gratitude and grief sit at the same table? Can I let gratitude and anxiety and gratitude and depression all sit at the same table? Can I carry both of those things? Gratitude is not the opposite of grief. It's actually what reminds us that grief came from love, and love is still worth noticing. So as I wrap this episode up and I reflect on my conversation with Brandon, I want to go back to those 4 questions that I mentioned in the introduction. And I want you to take away these 4 questions and see if you can find ways to improve your mental health as you consider all of the things that we've talked about in this episode. The first question is, can I be corrected without collapsing? And remember, that is working on switching from an inner critic to an inner coach. The next one, which is probably my big takeaway, can I succeed without immediately moving the finish line? Can I pause and celebrate what is right in front of me and be grateful for the experience that I had of one moment of success? The next question is, can I fail without turning it into a life sentence? And again, this is where we start to detach performance from our identity, where we recognize that performance is something that we do, identity is who we are. And so failure doesn't have to be a life sentence, and it definitely doesn't have to be our identity. And the last question is, can I stay grateful without denying what hurts? Can I allow gratitude to be a key player in nervous system regulation? So I just want to remind everybody that becoming a mentally healthy person, it's the slow work of becoming steadier and wiser and more compassionate and more curious and more honest. And I say the steady, slow work because it takes time. Give yourself grace and just try to practice some of these principles every day. Mental health is learning to receive correction without shame, and it's learning to celebrate success without becoming defined by it. To question the stories your mind automatically creates. It's practicing gratitude without denying reality. It means to keep becoming one ordinary day at a time. So I want to just tie this back to my son Peyton because this podcast is honor of him. And we always called him Pete. But I can't help but think that these are the kind of conversations that Pete would have loved to hear and to be a part of. He was a deep thinker and he loved to talk about this kind of stuff. The other thing that I learned from him is that it's okay that we don't have all the answers. You see, a mentally healthy person doesn't have all the answers. It just means that we're willing to ask better questions. So I guess the question that I want to leave with you is, where is mental health inviting you to grow right now? Maybe it's learning to coach yourself instead of criticize. Maybe it's letting yourself enjoy something good. Maybe it's applying for the thing or starting the thing or saying the thing before you reject yourself first. Maybe it's noticing what's still good without pretending nothing hurts. So I would invite you all to reflect and think about this. I also just want to remind you that I have a digital download that aligns with this episode. So if this is something that you want to take and dig a little deeper with and do some journaling and some reflection, go to valentinecounseling.org and find my digital download along with all the other ones that go with all the other podcast episodes. Also, if you think that this is helpful and meaningful, please just like the episode, give it a review, share it, because the more that you do that, the more people that we can reach. Thank you so much. And until next time, for Pete's sake, take good care of yourself and good care of each other. Thank you so much for spending time with me on the For Peyton podcast. My hope is that this conversation gave you something to think about, something to carry with you, or maybe a reminder that you're not alone. If you'd like to go deeper, you'll find companion episodes and related digital downloads for each topic at valentinecounseling.org. This will help you continue reflecting, learning, and applying what resonates. Until next time, for Pete's sake, take care of yourself and each other. This is for Peyton.